Alrighty, gang. Thank you for joining me for another great episode of Photoshop for Artists. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the chat. It'd be nice to know where people are tuning in from all around this fine blue dot in the sky. So today we're going to talk about something really important if you want to be drawing and painting in Photoshop, and that is the ability to do what I would call quote-unquote painterly blends in Photoshop. So we've already in this series talked about custom brushes and a lot about how they work, how to create your own, things like that. But one of the things that's important is understanding how to work really efficiently when you are in the act of painting and getting the results that you want. And a large part of painting is transitioning from one color to another, from one value to another, controlling your edges, whether they be soft edges or harder edges, more crisp edges. And this all comes down to blending and controlling the brush in a certain way where you can blend in the way that you want. And we are going to talk about 5 different ways to approach this, or rather we're going to cover this in 5 different little sections. The first of which is to just cover the very basic approach and most standard approach to how to blend between one color and another using just brushes in Photoshop. And we're going to use the most basic brush, which is the hard round brush, with opacity being tied to the pen pressure you use with your stylus. And from there we're going to move on to custom brushes, and we're going to then look at the difference in the results you get with various custom brushes and how to fine-tune those behaviors. Then we'll look at color dynamics and how those come into play when you want to create some blends. We'll then move on to mixer brushes, another interesting category of brushes that you find in Photoshop, and we'll conclude by looking at the smudge tool. So you have lots and lots of different ways to do this. It's amazing how many options you have as an artist in Photoshop for painting. A lot of people forget that, and I'm here to remind you. So let's head over to Photoshop and take a look. All right, so just pause for a moment and say hi to some fine folks who are just joining us here over on Behance. Now remember, if you're watching on Twitter or YouTube, I'm going to be following the chat over on Behance. That's be.net/Adobe Live. All right, let's see. We got Annika. What's up, Annika? And Sylvie and Jack and Steve and Z. We also have RB joining us. Afroha is here. Hello, Afroha. Gareth, how are you? Nice to see you joining us as well. I'm really glad that you're all here and ready to do some painting together. So let's move right to it. We're going to go to just a basic round brush in Photoshop. So I'm going to go to my brush settings, turn all this fancy business off of the brush I currently have here, and under brush tip shape, I'm just going to select a round brush. The hardness is set to 100%. We'll turn off all of the angle jitter and size jitter and all these other things. And we're just going to have a basic hard round brush that paints like this, okay? Nothing fancy at all. In fact, I'm even going to turn off shape dynamics for now. So this is the brush that I have. The first thing I'm going to do is just enable transfer. And what this is going to allow me to do is control with pen pressure, okay, the opacity of the brush stroke. All right, so with light pressure, I get less opacity, and with heavy pressure, I move right on through to 100% opacity. And this is important for blending, and I'll show you the most basic technique people use when they want to blend from one color to another. So let's say, for example, using just my elliptical marquee tool here, I have an area of color here, and next to it I'm going to put a different color altogether. I'm going to use this color here. There we go. And I'll just add a little circle right here where we have these two colors overlapping. Now what I want is for there to be a blend between these two colors, okay? Now using just this hard round brush, this is the technique that I'll employ. I'll sample the green right here by holding down my Option key, okay? Now if you're on a PC, every time I say hold down my Option key or Option this or Option that, you think Alt, A-L-T. So Option on Mac equals Alt on PC. I'm a big proponent of using keyboard shortcuts, and if you've watched this show in the past, you know that we have an episode dedicated 2, working with key commands as part of the learning process here for being somebody who wants to paint in Photoshop and do it efficiently and do it quickly. All right, so here we go. I'm holding down the Option key and tapping here to select the green. Now, with full pressure, I can pull green into the mix like this, okay? But with less pressure, with my stylus, okay, I can paint like this, and you'll notice that because I don't have full opacity, I've created another color in between the green and the blue. And this is because some of that blue is peeking through the green that I've laid down with less opacity. And so now what I can do is select that color and paint with it in between these two areas. And by using this color and using less pressure painting in this area, I can grab colors that are being shown to me right here and paint with those and continue this process so that I'm getting a blend, okay, from one color stepping its way through, okay, to the color in the middle and then into the color on the left. See this? I select that color, I paint a little bit, I select this color, I paint a little bit, select my green again, paint into that. Notice that I'm changing the direction of the brush as I paint as well, okay, just to kind of mix it up. But you see how this works, okay? And that is the most basic way to paint with blends in Photoshop. And this is, again, just using standard hard round brush tied to opacity with the pressure that I'm exerting with the stylus. All right, and if I zoom in, you'll see what we've got there. Now, with all of this stuff going on, another thing you can do, which is great, is to lock your layer transparency. Okay, you all remember how to do that. I can come over to the layer right here, and I can lock transparency by tapping on this little icon right here. But the other thing I can do is I can tap on the backslash, okay, or is it forward slash? I can never remember which is which. I'm going to say forward slash under the question mark, okay, on my keyboard. That'll automatically lock that layer transparency. And what I could do here is make my brush really big and then go down to my brush tip and reduce the hardness so it's a soft brush, okay? And now if I take this color in the middle and paint gently with it like this, take this color and paint gently, take this color and paint gently. This is how you create a really, really soft, smooth blend. So the brush strokes are not visible. So just with a round brush, this is a standard brush in Photoshop, controlling the hardness of the brush, the size of the brush, and the opacity tied to the pen pressure, I've just shown you two different ways that you can blend with the brush, okay? Now that is the most standard way to blend any two colors together, and people are using it constantly, day in and day out. So for example, they'll have a color, they'll be painting with it, they'll grab another color, they'll paint with it, use less pressure, sample that color in the middle, paint with it, and so on, until eventually they get to what they want with their blend. Remember, sampling is the key. You have to constantly be using that eyedropper tool as part of this process. And the more comfortable you get with that, the faster you get with it, and it just becomes a really natural thing you're doing in your paintings all the time. Now, the other cool thing about using a brush like a hard round brush is that you can control edges, okay? And what I mean is the quality of the edge, whether it's a hard edge or a soft edge. So if I go back to the hardness of the brush being really, really firm at 100%, okay? And I then come in here and paint an area, and I decide that I'm going to have a blend, okay? Let's say, for example, that I'm going to have the edge of something and it's going to get softer at the top. So I grab this color here, and let's say I enter the picture like this, then I use less pressure here, okay? So hard edge here, and then less pressure here. Grab that color, soften that up. Make my brush smaller. And let's say I'm turning this corner here, and I want this to be a softer edge right here. So here's the hard edge. I can just paint over that same area multiple times. Turn the corner here, choose that color in the middle, and blend. Like so. Again, I can use that larger brush trick right here if I lock my layer transparency and use bigger strokes to come in from all angles and soften that up. And there you go. So what I've got now is this edge that starts as a hard edge here and transitions to a softer edge here. Okay? And a lot of people switch back and forth between having that round brush with a soft edge and the round brush with a hard edge to get what they want. And when you combine that with your lasso tool, and keep that layer transparency locked, you have lots of control about how you want to deal with the colors in here. So for example, if this area has to have a highlight and I make my brush bigger, I can come in, knock that in there, and then reduce the hardness of the brush, grab this color here, and just kind of soften it like that. And soften the areas here in these transitions as well. So what you're seeing here is more akin to, I would say, sort of a look that you would get with a traditional airbrush, something along those lines. And of course, there are times when you're using brushes that are more organic in appearance, okay? And with those kinds of brushes, well, what do you need to do in order to achieve a blend that feels like the rest of your painting? And that's what we can get to here with the next little area I want to look at, which is using custom brushes to do your blends, okay? So I think we've covered this here. You get the idea. It's very effective and really, really works. You know, I can even knock in little edge highlights there if I want to. Pretty fun. Okay, so you get the idea with this main technique. All right, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and I can answer them for you. But let's now take a look at what we're going to do with custom brushes, of which there are thousands, of course. Question from Christopher on YouTube. It says it's a bit like the smudge tool. No, the smudge tool will just smudge. There's no painting with the smudge tool. I'm only painting here. The effect at the end, the result at the end, looks like what the results of some of the smudge tools might produce, but we'll cover the smudge tool at the end today and show you ways to use that effectively in combination with the brushing. Remember that the smudge tool is technically a brush tool, in so much as you can use the same stamps that you've designed for your brushes. It does have limited capabilities with regards to brush settings. You cannot, with a smudge tool, for example, employ a texture that will actually show up very well. And you also cannot really have a dual brush effect at all. Dual brush does come in handy for brushing. The smudge tool has its limitations, but it's also very, very good for blending, and we'll take a look at it. All right, so custom brushes. So now, of course, you have one of my favorite areas of interest in Photoshop, as you know, which is custom brushes, of which I've designed over 2,000 for all of you to play with. If you are a Photoshop or Adobe Fresco user, wondering where the brushes are in Photoshop, don't worry, you just have to come up to your brushes panel, and in the top right corner, there's a little drop-down menu here, and you can go to Get More Brushes. And when you tap on Get More Brushes, it's going to launch a page for you on Adobe's website. And that is the login page for brushes right here. And you'll notice that I've already logged in, and I can then have access to the new Summer 2023 brushes, which just got released this past Friday. Here they are. And these are all the other brush sets that you've got to play with, okay? And there are over 2,000 of them, like I said, along with quarterly brush updates. So many to play with. So check those out. We're going to go through a couple of those actually today, but we're going to start with some basics. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the Megapack, and here we have the category for the paint box. And in the paint box, you're going to see a whole ton of brushes. I believe there are over 60 or 70 different brushes in here, maybe even more. But we're going to start with something really, really basic, and that's this roughen brush right here. All right. And I'm going to grab the roughen brush and just paint this orange color here. Okay. And you'll notice that when I use less pressure, just as before, I get less opacity. But the nice thing about the roughen brush now, when we're dealing with a brush stroke that actually leaves a different mark on the canvas with much more interest and texture than just a basic round brush. So as you can imagine, the blending possibilities here are going to be a lot more organic, a lot more interesting. So as I'm painting with it, if I decide that over here on the left is where I'm going to use another color to blend, I just use lighter pressure, like so. And if I grab my blending color and come in from this side and use lighter pressure, grab that color in the middle and paint between the two, already I've got a pretty decent transition from one to the other. And as before, I just pull in with these other colors, some brush strokes crisscrossing, going this way and that to create a blend. Okay, let's try something where we use a color that is darker, like this, and then we want to transition to a lighter version of that color. Well, I'll simply do this. Use less pressure, and since white is my canvas color, okay, let's say I want to use a color like this to blend, pull it in, and then as I use less pressure and blend this way, there's very little I really have to do there because I'm letting the opacity of the paint take over and letting that canvas color come through. But I can grab that color in the middle, blend some more, grab this color, and paint as before. Okay? And one of the things I like is to have these kinds of areas where sometimes it's a little less perfect, you know what I mean? Because this is part of what has that custom brush charm, if you will. All right, is that you're getting the texture and the brush strokes included in everything that you're making, and that makes it look better. Okay, so same technique, different result thanks to the properties of the brush. Now you could go through with any of these and find the ones that you think do the best work for you. For example, if you want to use this Impressionist canvas brush, you're going to get a brush that has a nice canvas texture built in as you paint. Okay? So you should be able to see that canvas texture coming through. Again, light pressure. Heavy pressure means I'm going to lay down full opacity with the paint. We'll go ahead and grab a very, very light color here to blend with. And already, because of the opacity, I'm getting a perfect color in between to just hit that area. Use lighter pressure here, grab that color. Please take note of how many times I'm hitting the canvas with that eyedropper tool to sample color and make these blends effective. It's a constant thing that's happening. And this is something you have to get used to. But really, I'm telling you, once you've got it, you've got it. It's going to become just this thing that you do constantly. So there's a really nice blend between these two colors, which has little bits and pieces of one color poking out into the other, right? You can tone those down if you don't like them, but I think they really add a lot of personality and character to it. And that's just kind of a function of the brush there, and it's one of the looks that I love, and it's very different from the look we have here. It's obviously very different from the look we have here. So let the characteristics of the brush become part of the work. All right, even with something like this, a brush that is really, really strange looking, this encaustic grit, okay? It still takes advantage of pen pressure for a lighter value. So if I lay that color down and use lighter color here, and then change my blend mode from multiply to normal, because multiply is its normal setting, all right, or default setting, I could do some really cool blends between colors using a brush as weird as this one. Okay, this has so much texture and craziness going on, right? But we could take another color here, paint with it, use less pressure right there, and paint in between with that color we've just produced using light opacity, and get a blend between the two, like so. All right, so you can do this with any brush. Also, again, really fun to just go ahead and have an area with a hard edge and then blend between the two colors inside a hard edge shape using a lot of texture and a lot of variation. All right. So there are lots and lots of brushes that will take advantage of this if you use the brushes in the Megapack paint box. And you'll also find in here a couple of options with watercolor emulation. Is let's see, the one I really like is this color fill. Here it is, Kyle's Paint Box Watercolor Fill. And you'll see that this has a built-in paper texture like watercolor, and you can go really, really, really faint as you let that color just disappear right here on the edge. Knowing that I want to add a different blend right there, I can come in from this side and then just paint out to nothing with my pen pressure, and the blend you get between the two is really lovely there. Very effective. And again, you can paint with different blending modes with your brush. So while this is currently set to multiply, if I again change the mode to normal, this means that I can come over an area where I see a visible seam, and I can repeatedly paint over it until that seam goes away, okay? And then I can blend more effectively without that seam, like so. So you can bounce back and forth between your blend modes. If you go back to multiply now and paint over that same area, you can bring back in some of that paper texture. You're simply using light pressure to sort of glaze over the surface and apply just a little bit of texture to it. So that's another effective way of working. Okay? Also, like when I use a color that doesn't normally jive really well here, because of that ability to use really, really light pressure as I paint over it. That opacity really helps to create a very natural transition from one area of color to another. Okay, so custom brushes, so many to play with. Just taking a quick look inside some of the more recent sets we've got released here. If you were to look at, for example, the spring 2023 brushes, there's a brush here called Impress Control, and this one has a really good impressionistic look to it. And again, light pressure means less opacity, but still plenty of texture. Okay? And so pulling in that yellow on top there and then using less pressure as I push over the blue means I'm going to get some nice kind of little greens in there. And I can sample those greens and paint with them and make a lovely impressionistic transition from that blue to that yellow, like so. And all the qualities of that brush really sing in that transition. Comparing again the result here to what we've done on the outset, very, very different. Now, so far we've just used this one technique, okay? But what else can you do? Well, this is the most standard way that people paint. They do this day in and day out. You'll probably find yourself doing this more often than anything else as well. But let's take a look at some other things you can take advantage of. We're going to look at next our color dynamics. Okay, I'll pause for a moment to see if we have any questions. What's your eyedropper sample size? Well, the eyedropper sample size actually is usually whatever your brush stamp size is. So if I'm painting with a brush, this one, for example, right now is set at 400 pixels, okay? The eyedropper sampling, though, for a mixer brush, which we'll get to later, is going to be the sample size of the actual brush. But I believe that with Photoshop, if you're sampling any area, it's usually just 1 square pixel. I'm pretty sure that's what it is, which is why you're able to sample something so specific. Okay, if you look at my color picker over here, you'll notice that when I come over here, okay, I'll just zoom in more so you can see the pixels. Here's that color, here's that color. So I'm literally sampling pixel by pixel. So yeah, this is very specific. But with the mixer brush, it's different. We'll talk about that. You'll see the difference. Okay. Hey Jordan, thanks for joining us. Nice to see you. Gus says, do you use special gear in addition to your computer and Photoshop, drawing pads, styles, etc.? How about folks getting started? So I'm currently drawing on a Cintiq 22 HD from 2018. So this baby's already 5 years old. And there was nothing wrong with my other Cintiq I had before that. I donated it to a school. When I get new Cintiqs, I just wind up donating the old ones because they never break. I've never had a Wacom device break on me or stop working. Huge fan of Wacom, W-A-C-O-M. But I will say that they are pretty expensive. However, they've also released some less expensive models in the past few years. There's a Wacom model that's a 16-inch model, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it's Wacom One, O-N-E. And I found that to be a really excellent starter tablet. And I do prefer drawing on a screen. I think the disconnect between drawing somewhere else and then looking at a separate screen can take some getting used to. And if you're a beginner and have not worked digitally before, that disconnect can sometimes cause a lot of frustration and even cause people to say, you know, I give up, and they don't want to continue with it. And I don't want that to happen. So if you can get some kind of surface you can draw on directly, there are also competitor models that are cheaper. I have never tested any of those, and I've heard mixed reviews. I'd say the Wacom One is the way to go if you're going to start with a display that you can draw on, that you want to hook up to your PC or to your Mac. Of course, if you're going to work on an iPad, then I recommend just using Fresco. The Apple Pencil is a very good drawing tool. The brushes in Fresco are fine-tuned to work for that specific surface, and should work very well. And both in Fresco and Photoshop, don't forget, for those people, now this is different from blending, but if you're going to be doing inking work, which many, many people love to draw, of course, myself included, not just paint, then you're going to be using a brush, say, for example, like the Belgian Companion from this same brush set. And let's say I'm drawing with it, and then I realize that my lines are like a little shaky, a little wobbly, they're not quite what I want. Well, don't worry, you have this option here to increase smoothing. So if I were to bump that up to, say, 30% in Photoshop, the result is that the lines I draw are going to be really, really smooth and lovely, okay? All those curves and waves are going to be exactly what I want. So you have a great little digital assistant that you can employ at any time using smoothing, and that's in both Fresco and Photoshop. And I think that'll make a huge difference, especially if you are drawing on a tablet that is not an on-screen drawing device. So if you were to work with a basic Wacom Intuos tablet of some kind, for example, and you have to look elsewhere, that smoothing kicking in is really going to help you. Alrighty, so let's take a look now at color dynamics and how amazing they are and useful when you're painting. We're blending. This is different from the technique we've been using up until this point. If you look in your brush settings, you're going to see color dynamics. Now, currently, this brush does have color dynamics employed per stamp. That means every instance of the stamp that I put down, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for this brush, is going to have a slight adjustment made to the hue and to the brightness, okay, of whatever color I have selected. And so the result is that you get something that looks like this, where it looks kind of like a solid color, but if you were to really study closely, you'll see some little variations in there. And if you want to see what's really happening, I'll push this up really high, my brightness jitter, and now you can see the result of that. Okay, but I don't like it to be that crazy, so I have that set at a lower number, okay, for this particular brush. And this is the result, all right? But you do have some visible brush strokes when you layer over it because of those subtle adjustments that are happening. Now, this is not what I want to talk about with the blending, however. With the blending, we're going to take advantage of a different feature in color dynamics, which is this ability to actually, if you look up here at the top, change between your foreground and your background color while you're painting. This is crazy, right? So if my foreground color is, for example, blue right now, and I set my background color, all right, to say this very lemony yellow color, like so. All right, so I've got these two colors now. Currently, if I paint, I'm going to use only the foreground color, all right? But we're about to change that by coming over here to where it says foreground background jitter, and we're going to take the control and set it to pen pressure, okay? Now what this means is with less pressure, I'm going to be using some of that yellow color. With more pressure, I'm going to be using the blue. Same brush, okay? Pretty crazy. That means I can come in here and do this, and then lighten the pressure as I go until I get to here. So now you're talking about a really powerful and interesting way to blend. If you know the two color areas you want to blend between, let's say, for example, you're painting a sky and you want to have a gradation in there that's really painterly and kind of interesting, and you want to paint the whole thing in one pass and control it with pen pressure using one of your custom brushes, you can employ this technique. Heavy pressure, more foreground color. Background pressure, more background color. Lighter pressure, more background color. I think I better drink some coffee or my brain won't work. Alrighty. Peter, what's up? Thanks for joining us. Umacorn, nice to see you as well. Doris, hello. John, if you hold shift, will it give a better straight line? John, good question. Good question. You will get a straight line holding shift. The only problem is in Photoshop, that straight line is guaranteed to only give you verticals and horizontals. You can't draw, for example, a diagonal line in a very specific direction. Unlike Fresco, where you can simply draw, hold for a moment, and it'll snap to what's called a snap line, and then you can position that line at whatever angle you want, and it will remain straight. Same goes for shapes. I'd love to see some of these features make their way into Photoshop soon, and I have been pestering the Photoshop team about this for a while now, so let's see if I can get anywhere with them. You might think that because my name is in the app, I have a little bit of power to move that gigantic boat, but it's harder than you think. All right. Doctor Who, what's up? Thanks for joining us. Had no idea you were into painting, Doctor Who. Anthony is here as well. Cool. Any other questions? Let's see. Annika, thanks for throwing in that link for the brushes. Appreciate that. Drink coffee or brain won't work, says Clever. Yes, you are correct, and hello to you as well. And Liberato Barrera Rodriguez, what a great name. Nice to see you as well. Thanks for joining. All right, so cool. Check that out. That is a really interesting technique. You may remember a moment ago we were working with that brush in the Megapack, which emulated a watercolor look, and that was that fill brush. Okay, so if I go back for a moment to that brush, right down here, okay, watercolor fill. Remember that all these brushes are customizable. You can edit them and make them do what you want. So if I now come in here, and now that we understand what this does, and I say that I want to control with pen pressure my foreground and my background color, using this brush, well, now I can do things like this. I can paint with that blue and then use less and less pressure as I go down, and it's going to be pulling in more of that green, like so. You say, yeah, but Kyle, I'm not really getting that green so much. I'm getting a really, really light version of it. Don't forget, this brush also has opacity of the brush stroke tied to pen pressure. So what do you do about this? No problem. Go into transfer and see where it says that your minimum opacity is 0. Just bump that up to something like 60% or 70%. And now look at the difference as I paint with the blue and then move down here to the green and the yellow. You can see the difference between here and here. I'm getting a lot more of that color coming through, okay? If I reduce the, or eliminate the flow jitter, okay, which was also tied to pen pressure, I can start with a very light amount of pressure and get that same color, okay? And then build up as I go right here. And then lighten it up in the middle, etc., 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 etc. You get the idea, okay? So you really do have all the controls you need, and if you hit upon a set of controls or settings that you love for a specific brush, and you want that to be a brush that you can save and use later, it's really easy. Whatever you do with the brush and you say, okay, I really want these, come down to the little plus sign. Now, if you can't see that because of my bar at the bottom of my live stream screen, I'm going to pull my brushes menu up for a moment so you can see this little plus sign here. You just tap on that and you save yourself a new brush. All right. And if you even want to include the color of that brush, let's say you're going to constantly use the same color for a very specific purpose for a very specific brush, you can even tell Photoshop you want to include that color. Okay. And in the latest versions of Fresco coming out here before Max, we'll be able to honor that as well. If you have a brush that you've saved with a color, that color will remain locked to that brush until you decide to change it. Okay, so that's cool that you can transfer back and forth like that. Okay, so that is the color dynamics method of blending. Pretty cool. All right, now if there are any questions about that, let me know in the chat. Otherwise, I'll move on. How to record a brush as a dynamic one? Julian, I think, are you asking about brushes in Fresco? And if you are, that's my guess. Pencil as a dynamic one. When you say dynamic, I think you're thinking maybe about the live watercolors and oils, but please correct me if I'm wrong and I can answer that question for you. Okay? Technically speaking, Photoshop doesn't have quote-unquote dynamic brushes. If you're talking about color dynamics, those are always saved with the brush. So don't worry, whatever settings you have there, they are absolutely tied to the brush that you create, 100%. Yes, endless playgrounds, says Frank. Agreed. Okay, let's take a look now at mixer brushes, another category of brushes in Photoshop, often overlooked, but very powerful indeed. If you go into the Real Oils category here of the Megapack, you have a bunch of mixer brushes already preset there, ready to go. You can try them straight out of the box and see how they behave. For example, let's take something like the Sargent 2017 brush, named after John Singer Sargent. Now with this same color, if I put some color down here, no big deal. This looks like a regular brush, doesn't seem to be doing anything I couldn't do elsewhere. Okay, nothing fancy. However, again, grabbing another color and painting into the blue, you will see something happen here. Look at that. You're actually getting some mixing happening between those two colors. Okay? See that? If I pull from the blue outwards, remember I have yellow on my brush, look what it did. It pulled some of that blue into the yellow. So for those of you using oils day in and day out and you're painting lives and you want to transition to a digital environment or work with both and need something that's going to be making it possible so that the look isn't too different, too unfamiliar, then you can simply use the mixer brushes in Photoshop here to do some really cool stuff. And the great thing about these is you have all of these settings up here, all right? You can get really, really nitty-gritty up here with the settings. You can get into the weeds, as they say. Watch out for ticks. By controlling the wetness of the brush, the load of the brush. Load just means how much paint have you put on there. If you put like a full 100% load of paint, which means when I apply paint over an area that's already got color, okay, then obviously the color that's already on the canvas, if I have less paint on my brush, it's going to have more of an influence on the color I wind up with as I start to scrub around there on the canvas. Wetness of the brush, how dry is that paint? If it's really, really wet, it will mix more easily with what's on the surface. If it's really dry, it will more sort of sit on top of the surface and mix less. Mixing, of course, is mixing. You have a very solid control there for deciding if you want to have more or less mixing with the colors that are on the screen already. And flow is how quickly does the paint get deposited onto the canvas. Like if you can imagine that the paint is running down the bristles of your brush, how quickly is it flowing, running onto the canvas? Is it really, really sluggish like molasses, or is it flowing out like water? There's your answer, okay? Why not just use Fresco for painting? Because, John, a lot of people don't have iPads, but if they do, great. Or maybe Windows devices that are compatible. And I encourage people, if they do have an iPad, of course, use Fresco. And but what I love is everything I create in Fresco automatically shows up in Photoshop on my homepage and vice versa. So I bounce around a lot between the two, and even in the same document. Let's see. So you mean the brush form with a little brush logos is Julian. You're talking about saving the brush. This I don't know what you mean. This is a brush. A brush is a brush. You have mixer brushes. You have standard painting brushes. So not sure. Julian, I think I need more clarification about what you mean by saving the brush. All of the brushes can be saved. Smudge tools can be saved. Any tool preset you want to save in Photoshop, all of these can be saved. Right here, if you look at any of your tool presets, you have this option up here, new tool preset or save tool presets. You can save settings not just for brushes, but things like even the eyedropper tool, gradient tools, whatever you want. You can save your own custom tools in Photoshop. Very cool. Lisa Carney, what's up, Lisa? Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us, and long time no see. Alrighty, so mixer brushes, pretty fantastic. Now, you can really go to town with these and change a lot of the settings just as you could with any brush, okay? And that includes how the mixer brushes are going to behave with regards to pen pressure, pen tilt, etc. So in this way, they're similar to standard Photoshop brushes, but there is a difference in that you cannot employ a dual brush setting. You cannot employ color dynamics. Now, what's interesting is that as we continue to develop and build Fresco, some things are changing with regards to what you can and can't do with some of the tools that you have in Photoshop that are specifically designed for people who draw and paint. So, for example, smudge tools in Fresco will actually guard your textures. That's pretty nice. And we're also looking into having mixer brushes, okay, work with dual brush settings in certain blend modes. So that could be pretty exciting as well. Nevertheless, with these very few limitations, you do still have some very powerful options, and you can see even here in the real oil category, we already have about 35 or 40 different options for you to play with, each of which is going to feel very different. Here's a very bristly brush, and I'll use color you can see more clearly. Still with that same canvas texture, and you'll notice how it blends differently right there with what's on the canvas. Now, a lot of this has to do with the transfer properties. In other words, how much of the opacity is affected by the pressure that I'm exerting. And in this case, with a brush like this, very little. Okay, the opacity is really not changing that much at all, which is why you get these stronger pulls of color, okay, where you get a more visible kind of a pushing of the paint rather than a softer blending of the paint. I can take advantage of all this stuff. You've got brushes like the bristle cut as well, which has a similar sort of way of blending the paint, like so. So looking for that naturalistic way of working and really want to play with a oils kind of a look. This is, after all, the subject of today's show, which is about blending. Look at that great blend I can get between those colors. Very painterly, very smudgy, very oils and acrylics kind of a thing. Now, here is the superpower you might not know about with mixer brushes. Are you ready? If you look at this area here, I've got a blue, a yellow, and an orange all kind of sitting next to one another, blending beautifully. But let's say that I really want to step it up a notch and paint in the way that I would paint with real media, where sometimes I just want to grab my brush. Okay, now your mixer brushes have their own separate color window right here. Normally you have your color pickers, okay, down here, but here you have one just for your mixer brush, where you have a couple of interesting options, such as being able to clean the brush after every stroke, which you can leave off, load the brush with fresh paint after every stroke, but look here, load solid colors only. There's a little check mark. If I tap on that, okay, you'll notice now that it's gone. Now what this means is, okay, remember earlier in the show, there was a question about how big the eyedropper sample size was. Well, with mixer brushes, it winds up being whatever the diameter is of your brush. So my brush is currently set at 150 pixels, okay? I'll make it one click bigger, now it's 175. Now, if I look at this little area here, and I just hold down the Option key and tap right there, I want you to glance over here at my color area for the mixer brush, and you will see a miniature snapshot of this entire area. What does this mean? Well, check it out. That is a single brush stroke, my friends, using that brush. So now you're getting into some really exciting territory. All right, this is some pretty cool stuff. Can't do this with a regular brush, and despite the minor limitations I mentioned earlier with the mixer brush, this is one of its superpowers, and so I'd say they offset each other quite nicely. Give that a try. All right, again, that's me just using the eyedropper tool, sampling an area, and then painting. Okay, sampling an area, and then painting. Two colors at once. Ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. Beautiful. So, very interesting, very interesting, very interesting. Yes, check it out. What's up, General Kenobi? Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Let's see. I'm just checking to see if we had any more questions. Lisa says, hey, you changed my entire job workflow with the brushes. Oh, wow. Lisa, that's so cool, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Really, really nice. Big ups to you. Doris says, Fresco's great, but has some disadvantages. What I miss the most is brush management. Oh, don't worry, Doris. More brush management is on the way. We're working on that, so it is coming to you. You need not worry. Many, many, many things. We update Fresco about every 6 to 8 weeks, in fact, which is crazy. So that gets a ton of updates throughout the year. All right, so there you go, right? Pretty fun. Now, the last thing I told you I was going to talk about today was the smudge tool. So let's take a look at that. We've just covered a whole bunch of goodies today, but we're going to look at one more thing here, and that is our delightful little smudge tool. So let's go back to our brushes, and we'll exit the real oils. We're getting out of the mixer brush category now. We're just going to head into the regular brushes again. And I think, let's see, I'll grab something from maybe one of the later brush releases. So we have the we look, fall 2023 is coming, folks. It's coming soon. But the summer brushes were just released. Let's crack those open. Okay, a lot of interesting things to play with in there. Lots of fun. And let's see, I've got the oily goodness brush right here. All right, so playing with this oily goodness brush, put some color down. Really, this is a fun one. Ooh, I love it. All right, now let's say I've got an area here, and then an area here right next to it, and I've got this solid transition or lack of transition. I got this edge between the two. Okay, and that's fine, but I decide that I want to blend. Now remember, of course I could do this. I could paint into it, grab another color, paint into it this way, and back and forth until I get a nice little sort of blend. And that's our standard way of blending. We have learned that right up at the top of the show, and now we understand how that works. And the result is great. It's fine. It totally does the trick. But check this out. We could use a single tool if we want to play around with this, okay, and do something similar. a smudge tool. So let's open again that Megapack, and if you look at the very top of the paint box, you're going to see some blending tools. So for instance, the Thrash Blend, okay, this is a really good one to match with a brush that has the properties of a brush like the Oily Goodness in the new summer brush set, because it has some scattering, some spacing, and some properties that if I blend like so, okay, it kind of feels like and works well with these brush strokes that I made with the new Oily Goodness brush. And so what's cool is I can pick and choose my smudge tools. I can choose a stamp, I can choose the spacing, I can choose how they're going to respond to pen pressure, the strength of the smudging, etc. And I can also save smudge tools in the same way that I would save brushes. So for example, in my brush settings under brush tip shape, let's say that for this smudge tool, I say, all right, I like it, but I want to go with something a little different and maybe something kind of similar to the brush stamp itself right here, okay? So I grab this, and then I can go to my strength and I can increase the strength of the blending and see how that does. Maybe too soft, so I go back to the drawing board and I can play around with some different options. Let's see. As you can see, I've got tons and tons of brushes to choose from. Maybe increase the spacing, decrease the scattering, pardon me. There we go. And I can then see how this will behave. I can reduce the brush size using my brackets. And when I see something like this where I get sort of a softer look, I know that part of the reason for that is spacing involved. Okay, so the spacing here I can increase so that as I move from one area to another, right, I'm going to get less instances of that smudge happening. So I go here to brush settings, increase the spacing. And if you want to turn spacing off altogether, you can move quickly into an area like this. So I'm moving my brush quickly. And what that does is the speed, the velocity is tied to the spacing. Now this is one of those things a lot of people don't realize about Photoshop's spacing settings. It's one of those things that doesn't get talked about a lot, but velocity is actually controlled. Spacing is controlled by velocity if you disable the spacing control altogether. This applies to any brush you're using as well. So if I go back to my brush tool, for example, and I paint. Now if I disable spacing and paint slowly, okay, it's going to build up paint really in tiny little spacing bits, okay, which means that every brush stamp is really close to the previous brush stamp. But if I move quickly across, okay, you can see the difference, right? You can even see space in between individual brush stamps. This is a really interesting thing, and this can come in handy for all kinds of things, but for smudging in particular, okay, so going back to smudging, this can be really handy because then I can use a stamp that has a lot of character, personality, etc., and I can take advantage of it, you know, turn off spacing, for example, with something like this. All right, we'll come back here to our blend and we'll just do this. And what you can see happening is you get actual evidence of that brush stamp in the blending, okay? So smudging is a really fast and efficient way to blend between two areas when you're in a pinch, and I recommend setting a hotkey for smudging. I use S, which is normally for something else, but you can go ahead into your preferences and you can set your hotkeys. On Mac, you go to keyboard shortcuts, but I believe on a PC it's in your preferences, okay? We've covered it all, folks. That's all the ways you can blend in a painterly way in Photoshop. There's so much you can do. It's such an amazing and powerful drawing and painting program. And yeah, now you've got all these superpowers tucked in your back pocket and you can make amazing stuff. So I want to thank you for being here for the show as usual. You've noticed that our schedule has changed. So pay close attention to what we're doing with our summer hours. There are going to be shows happening that you're used to, but they might not be at the hours you're expecting. So check that Adobe Live schedule over on Behance, and you know you're going to be all set, okay? Everyone, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, remember to be kind, and I'll say ciao for now.